What's going on, everybody? So you read the title correctly. This video is about a build that doesn't make any sense, but I did it anyways. And in just a moment, I will explain to you exactly why it was done and why it needed to be done. Okay, so the concept is rather simple, right? We have a necromancer who's only using the summoning skill tree, has high stats for melee combat, and is rocking heavy armor, and that's basically it. It's a very there's no fanciness about it. And the reason I did this is because 16 years ago, yes, 16 years ago, when I played Diablo 2 for the very first time, 13-year-old me thought that this was a cool and awesome build. Do I still think it's cool? Yeah, I think it's hilarious. But when I did it originally, it wasn't very good. And I wholeheartedly admit that it was bad. So, with the release of Diablo 2 Resurrected, I thought, let me revisit this. I'm wizened, I'm better at games. Can I make this build viable? Can I make this work? And that answer may surprise you. We'll talk more about the viability of this later in the episode. But the overall concept that I've gone for here was to build the necromancer out in a way that I could fight frontline with my summoned creatures. Now, that isn't a hard thing to do. You just bump up your health, your strength, and dexterity, and you go about it. Now, my logic was to sword and board it. I wanted to use a single-hand melee weapon and a shield to increase my viability and make me survive a little bit better, and it's worked out for me. I think that is kind of a crucial part of this build, in my opinion. And then when it comes to your summons, originally I was of the mind that more was better. Having a lot more summons was the way to go, but they were weaker, and you could just keep replenishing them. Well, originally that didn't work out too hot for me, so I decided to go for quality over quantity. And I think that's the sweet spot here. I think that is a huge factor in the viability of this build. Okay, so I will start off by saying that I do believe that this build can be viable. I think any build can, in fact, be viable. It just comes down to equipment, determination, and character level. I will say that starting out, this build was rough. It was very rough. There were certain abilities I was lacking. There was certain equipment I didn't have. And I just wasn't particularly strong in the beginning. That is evident. The necromancer is not intended to run around smashing things with a hammer with full plate mail on. And honestly, the build is quite redundant. It is a redundant build. And that, to me, adds a layer to kind of the comedy of the whole situation, because the summons are meant to pull aggro from the necromancer while he uses spells from the back, spells and curses, to whittle opponents down. And there I am, shoulder to shoulder with skeletons and Meat Man, beating people up with a hammer. But, as I said, this build is viable. I will say, I struggled very heavily up until about Act 3. And I'll explain that here in just a second. And I struggled through the first two acts. Not so much the first act. I think the first act is relatively easy in a lot of its approach. There's not a lot of enemies that cause you too much hassle. And Andariel is not very hard, And so the first act wasn't too bad. It was just kind of getting the build up and running, getting some levels up, getting the proper equipment, getting my strength up so I can equip better armor, and getting my health up and all that. That wasn't so much the problem. Act 2 is where I seem to have the most issue. In Act 2, because of certain enemies, and because, of course, if you don't have the resistances for your summoned creatures, the damned beetles that fart out electricity every time you strike them will mow through your stuff. And the amount of times I died trying to pull away from combat and then was hit by a wave of electricity is embarrassing. I will say the boss as well was the biggest turd burglar you could find. What a jerk. What an absolute jerk. And this is where the problem with this build comes in. One, you have no active combat abilities with this build. You don't have any spells, you have no curses. You can only hit things, and that's it. And so when you're fighting a boss that has no minions, you are stuck with your mercenary and your golem of choice. That's it. You know, your skeletons will probably die 4 seconds into the fight, and you are left with what you've got. That's it. It makes some of the bosses kind of a pain. Now, in terms of how I have my summon skill tree set up, I have it set up for 4 basic skeletons, 2 mages, and then of course I have all of the golems unlocked. I prefer to use the flesh golem because the flesh golem can return health to me, which means when I'm in the middle of a brawl, I can stay in the fight longer without having to disengage to heal myself. And that to me it's invaluable. I think it is a brilliant way to go, but also having your different golems for different encounters. Let's say I went to go fight Diablo, and I remember the first time I ever fought Diablo, it was a nightmare, and it was extremely difficult because my build was just terrible. Though this time I went to fight him, he only killed me once, and that was of my own stupidity. I used the fire golem to kind of tank hits as I smacked him in the back with a chain mace, and you know, using the flame golem versus the meat golem, it's all just about planning. You know, understanding what encounter you're about to get into and what golem is going to assist you the most. Now, generally, I think the meat golem is fantastic for this role. The meat golem against pretty much all your basic enemies is going to survive. I've had no issues with the meat golem through most of the standard fights. It's just when you get to bosses that you see that he's not as good as, let's say, the iron golem or the fire golem. In reality, this build is a late bloomer. I wouldn't say it was very good until I started hitting the upper 20s. You know, I ended up defeating Diablo at level 30, and I'm currently working on getting to Baal, the Lord's Destruction. And honestly, the build was kind of haphazard for a while there, and getting it up and running was tough. But in the end, I think it's viable. I think if you have the grit and determination and you get lucky with the right equipment and you make sure you grind and you're, you know, level or a little bit higher than where you're fighting, I think this build can be viable. The fact that I can rush in with a motley crew of skeletons, a meat man, and then just one random lady with a bow backing me up is hilarious. I love it. I love plowing into a fight and just, you know, cracking heads. I think it's awesome. I think it's fun. And at first, I didn't see that it was good up until I was able to defeat Diablo in relatively short order. And to think I beat Diablo with an archer mercenary, a flame golem, and a necromancer that is designed for melee combat. And I did it in less than 10 minutes. Like, it was a relatively easy fight. And as I said, I died once of my own stupidity. I missed the tell, and he Kamehameha'd me in the face with lightning. I was unprepared for it. But in the end, I beat him with very little hassle. I expected to die 2 or 3 times, but I ended up beating him relatively easy. So the build really comes down to knowledge and understanding how to use your summons to assist you in taking down fights. And as I said, the bosses are really the only trouble you're going to run into. And other than that, it's kind of fun. And plus, the necromancer's armor looks really sweet. It looks really cool, especially if you've got the skull helm on. It completes the look. It looks fantastic. I wish I still had the skull shield you can see me running around with in the video. But alas, I had to replace it for something more powerful. This is just the start though, guys. This is really the tip of the iceberg, as it were. And the next character I will be playing with is the Assassin. She is my least played character in all of Diablo 2. I'm not sure what skill tree I will be running, but you guys will just have to stay tuned and come back and make sure you catch that video coming out soon. But anyways, everyone, leave a like, a dislike, comment, and subscribe for more if you're not already subscribed. And as always, hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to catch you in the next video.